Hi folks, Happy New Year. I'm going to try and finish off the series of love and marriage videos in time for your mocks. So today we're going to have a look at Ovid. I think he's actually probably the most interesting poet on the unit. So Ovid is the poet who, after Augustus changed Roman marriage laws, he exiled Ovid. The reason that Augustus exiled Ovid's a bit controversial. So the story goes that it was because of Carmen, a song, and error, a mistake. The mistake, we think, is Ovid catching Augustus's granddaughter, I think Julia, having an extramarital affair. And actually, that's what prompted the Julian laws, which are the laws that Augustus brought in to try to really restore traditional values. And they involved things like fining women for being widows for more than a year, for example, if they were of childbearing age, because Augustus wanted them to have more Roman sons. It gave more powers to men to punish their wives if their wives committed adultery, but put more pressure on men to do that as well. So in the midst of all that, Ovid writes a set of poems called the Ars Amatoria, the Art of Love. These poems are actually in 3 books. 2 of the poems are addressed to men, books 1 and 2, which you're going to have a look at now in book 1. The 3rd book's actually addressed to women. It tells women what to do. And the focus is quite tongue-in-cheek. It's usually on how to have affairs and how to do the sorts of things that Augustus really wanted to stop people from doing. So that kind of context is really, really important because this is the controversial set of poems that Augustus was very unhappy with. But it suggests that Ovid's making fun of things that he's actually seeing people do in real life. Like Augustus didn't come up with new laws for no reason. So with that context in mind, we'll have a look at the Latin, we'll have a look at the English, and then we'll get stuck into the sorts of aspects of style you could pick out in the exam as well. So, si non accipiet scriptum in lectumque remitet, lectoram spera propositumque tene, tempore deficiles veniunt ad aratra juvenci, tempore lenta pati frena docentor equi. Accept what you've written and send it back unread. Okay. So if we have a look at this together, this vocab you know from the language paper. Scriptum, having been written, in lectum, having not been read, so unread, in lectum. Remitet, mitere, to send, remitere, to send back. Language you know from the language paper. Lectoram, she will read it. Now, this is a future participle. Lectoram, being about to read. Okay. Spera, hope. Tene, have. Like, have hope that she will read it. What else do we know from the language paper? Tempore, in time. Difficiles, here is stubborn. It looks like difficult, but here it's describing people, so I guess we could say difficult or stubborn. Veniunt, they come. Aratra is the plough. Juvenci is young bulls. It sounds like juvene is like young men. Juvenci is young bulls. But the fact that they sound similar is no accident, really. Ovid's making an analogy about young men. Tempore lenta, in time. Tempore, and then lenta, I guess, is like slowly. What else do we know? Docentor, they are taught. So doceo, docere is to teach. Docentor is they are taught. So it's passive. Again, it's a form that you've seen. To accept, pati is actually to suffer. So patior is deponent. So although pati looks like a passive infinitive, you'd always translate it as active. So to accept is probably a nice translation. It could be to suffer or to bear. But all of this is vocabulary you know from the language paper. So if you just fixate on that a little bit more, you'll be able to translate this a little bit more easily. Okay. Fereus assiduo consumitor annulus iussu, interit assidua vomer aduncus humo, quid magis est saxo durum, quid mollius unda. So iron is ferrius. If you're doing chemistry revision, Fe is iron on the periodic table, and that's because it's from ferrius. Annulus is ring. Iussu, with use. Okay. Assiduo is continuous. Now, this isn't on the language paper, but if you do something assiduously in English, that is a formal way of saying you do it repeatedly and conscientiously. And that's actually repeated again in assidua to make that parallel. So continuous use, continuous earth. Okay. What else do we have? Quid magis, what is greater, what is harder? And here magis dorum, like dorum is hard, magis dorum is more hard. So it's a bit like when we say more instead of Mollius is soft. And we get this in words in English like to mollify. If you mollify somebody, you soften them. Under is water, but here we also usually use under for waves. Think about the English word inundated. That means you're overwhelmed with things. So we can use Latin root words in English, or we can use words, from the language paper. Okay. Dura tamen molli saxa cavan doraqua. Pelopen ipsam, per sta modo, tempore vinces. Capta vides sero pergama. Capta tamem. Okay. Again, we've got dura, hard, molli, soft, aqua, water, tempore, time. Vinces is like conquered, and here it's you'll win over. So they're using it, again, like remember when we looked at Horace, we were thinking about love in quite a military way. Kind of seeing that a little tiny bit here. Capta, to be captured. Capta tamen, captured it was. So again, these verbs, like the idea of being overcome or being captured, give that idea of love in a military setting. We've got as well some proper nouns. So we've got Pelopen, Penelope. Pergama is Troy. So Troy's called Ilium, it's called Pergamum. If you got a noun like this on the language paper, places and people are always glossed on the language paper, so don't stress too much about them. But here we've got a mythological parallel, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about because we'll look at some of the images on the prescription at the end of this video. So the metre, again, I wouldn't get too bogged down in the metre, but there are a few things we can say that will give you a bit of a lift without getting too overwhelmed by it. Here it's quite a short poem, and Ovid's writing in elegiac couplets. The main thing you need to know about elegiac couplets is that elegy is sad. If you've got that, that'll help you to think about the content of the poem alongside the style of it. So you don't need to get too worried about scanning a line, figuring out the metre. What you'll notice is that you have 6 feet in the first line and 5 in the second. So you have hexameter followed by pentameter. In the second line, you have what we'd call a caesura, a big pause, okay? So if you really want to get quite nerdy about metre, you can find the caesura, you can find the big pause in the second lines, but honestly, don't stress about it. Knowing that it's elegiac, knowing that elegiac is meant to be traditionally a sad metre is probably enough, to be honest. If we look at the stylistic effects you can talk about in the exam, there are a few things going on here that we can pick out. So the first thing that we have is chiasmus. And I should have highlighted scriptum, sorry guys. We have chiasmus because we have the A, B, B structure. So accipiet, third person verb, A. Remitet, third person verb, A. Scriptum, accusative participle. It's not a noun, I guess it's a participle, isn't it? Accusative, perfect, passive participle, that's your B. Inlectum, accusative, perfect, passive participle, B. So really, if the grammar's bamboozled you there, think about the endings. Accipiet, remitet, same ending. Scriptum, inlectum, same ending. In that A, B, B, A structure, okay? And this is really just to emphasise the key themes in the line. The fact that the verbs are at the beginning and the end gives them a little bit more emphasis, and it builds a little bit of pace. There's quite a lot of action, actually, if you think about it, in these 4 words. Accepting, writing, not reading, and returning all happens really, really quickly. We have polyptotum, so we have the repetition of lectum, so same stem in the word is being repeated. If you are not happy with the different types of repetition, You can just say repetition. You can call it a repeated stem. But if you're at a point where you know these quite well, maybe revising the different types of repetition would be really helpful. Anaphora, for example, on the next line is another one. Anaphora or anaphora, however you pronounce it, doesn't really matter, is when the clause or line begins with the same word. And we see that with tempore, tempore. Okay, builds a little bit of pace up. Revise different types of repetition if you're ready to. If not, don't stress too much. Okay, we also have here a Republican trend. So when they talk about the iron ring, I think wedding rings at this time were iron, and then they are replaced with gold. So it's a very Republican trend of jewellery. And we have that repetition again of assiduo, assidua. Again, you could call it polypton, I guess, because it's the same stem. Okay, so a few structural things going on. But again, think about how it marries up with the context. So you have different effects building pace, you have the chiasmus, you have the anaphora to emphasise the change of times, and then you talk about the Republican rings and the fact that times are changing. I mean, if we think back to the context, times are definitely changing because morality, relationships is all kind of been revised by Augustus. And we know that because we know that Ovid got in a bit of trouble with him. If we look at the next slide together, we have this contrast of durum, hard, mollius, soft. So we thought about hot and cold when we were looking at Horace. Harsh and soft is like repeated as a theme. So this idea of refusing a lover and then kind of being won around is reflected in the harsh and the soft. If we look though at Penelope, she's a really interesting example because it's kind of hyperbolic. So this whole poem, remember, is being written as advice to somebody who's being rejected by their girlfriend or their would-be girlfriend. And he's saying you could win over, with time and persistence, Penelope herself. It's hyperbolic and it's possibly like quite bad advice and maybe suggests a bit of humour in the poem. The parallel of Troy being captured and a woman being captured, again, is bringing military imagery and the idea of conquest into relationships, and particularly the pursuit of a relationship. We see that in the anaphora of capta capta. Synecdoche, I mentioned that sometimes you'll see Troy is called Pergamum, and also Ilium. Pergamum, I think, is usually how the citadel, the inner bit of Troy within the walled city where the palace is, it's how that part of the city is described. So it's the heart of the city. Synecdoche is when you talk about part instead of whole. So you would never talk like this, but if you said to somebody who had a new car, great wheels, which you would never say, you're using synecdoche in English because you're complimenting the whole car. Like, it would be quite weird to just compliment the wheels. It would be, frankly, a bit odd. But it's like a slang term. Perhaps the reason we have synecdoche for Pergamum is because it's the heart of the city of Troy. It's the most kind of valued part of it. And I guess if we were going to be generous towards Ovid, he's talking about winning the heart of a woman. If we have a look at Penelope, this is actually one of the bits of artwork that could be put in front of you on the exam. And it's not an ancient piece of artwork. I think it's medieval, to be perfectly honest, looking at the style and how everyone's dressed and all that jazz. But there's a few important things going on. So the reason Penelope is brought up as an example of a woman who's hard to win around is because when her husband Odysseus leaves for Troy, he's gone for 10 years, and I think it takes him almost another 10 to come back. In the meantime, she has a group of suitors. So you can see the suitors on the right hand of this image all courting Penelope, trying to win her hand in marriage. And to be honest, they're not really after her for her. They just want to be the king of Ithaca because Odysseus is not around. So it's an interesting one because they don't really want her. They want the status that comes with being with her. And that could be another way of reading Ovid's poem, because we know that relationships weren't just forged out of love matches. They were kind of really there for social advantage in a lot of instances. Penelope's at the loom because she plays a trick in this myth. So what Penelope does is she tells the suitors, yeah, sure, I'll marry you once I have woven a shroud for my father-in-law Laertes. And so she spends all her time weaving, and then at night, her and her maids, or she and her maids, I should say, sit and they unpick the tapestry. They unpick the shroud so that she basically never has to marry anyone. It's a really good alibi because it's an alibi based on womanly duty. Like, you can't hassle me because I'm doing the right thing. Of course, I should weave a burial shroud for my father-in-law who is elderly, who doesn't have another daughter-in-law to do that for him. It's the perfect excuse. It's like if your parents ask you to unload the dishwasher and you say, I can't, I'm revising for my Latin exam. Case closed. And that's what Penelope's trying to do here. In the background of this picture as well, you can see a ship and a kind of stormy sea, and actually I think a little palace that could be part of Ithaca. But that is the promise of Odysseus's return. So it also could be kind of read into this poem that the reason the lover cannot woo his beloved, cannot win this woman round, is that she's married. That's another possible way of reading it. So if you know a little bit more about the story of Penelope, you can read this poem in a slightly different way. I would avoid going off on a tangent retelling the story in an exam, because ultimately you're going to get the marks from analysing the Latin. So if you are in an 8-mark question where you are really looking at the Latin closely, mention Penelope in a sentence, 2 sentences tops, and then crack on with the Latin and the effects and the style, because ultimately that's where you're going to get the marks. If you're asked a question about this picture, or there's a 15-mark question on like marriage, fidelity, anything like that, you could expand on it a little bit more, but just be really, really careful with that, because ultimately in the Latin exam, you're going to get the most credit for analysing the Latin, especially on the close reading questions. So I hope that's been helpful for you. I'm going to try and finish off the series before you go back for your mock, so you can cram a few in, and I'll link any helpful resources I can think of below. All right, good luck.